We, at Boston College and other schools, have observed and noticed some drastic changes happening around us. It feels like holiday, At the end of a meal, everyone is fighting over the bill, literally. So what now, my friend? Going Dutch. In the thick of technological tents, it didn't take long to encounter our first breakthroughs. In 2013, the Dutch Tax and Customs Administration deployed an algorithmic architecture, the risk classification model of the childcare benefit system. This autonomous AI system processed data pools to detect non-compliance and safeguard public funds. During operation, this unguided optimization produced a data bias. What constitutes as unjust? Distributive justice demands a systematic allocation of wealth, opportunities, and social burdens. Aristotelian politics states, to determine who gets what, you have to look at the merit of the person and the purpose of the thing being distributed. The Dutch system operated under a specific mandate: distribute accessible funds to families in genuine need. Instead, the system assigned a social burden to citizens based on heritage and name sounds, increasing the risk of error for an individual because of an arbitrary trait, conceptually identical to targeting someone for wearing a red hat, alters distributive equity. An injustice occurred. By 2019, investigators documented the systemic bias. Advocacy groups escalated a formal complaint to the United Nations under the Geneva Convention, 2020 framework on preventing social unfairness. Why did this architecture impact social structure? Because justice applies positive pressure to maintain equity, whereas utility holds back the onset of negative pressure. Because this crisis did not cause total societal collapse, we look past pure utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill argued that the moral worth of an action is judged entirely by the scale of its consequences, which, yes, works well when our thoughts frail to the fire of a burning home. If we rely strictly on utility, the system's jurisdiction meets its metrics, because utility does not prioritize fairness to the individual. In this framework alone, any one of us can be next to neglect. In response, lawmakers negotiated with human stakeholders to codify a solution. This dialogue mirrors Aristotelian virtue ethics, the pursuit of practical wisdom, the phronesis, through balancing the projected voices of the concerned parties. This collaboration manifested into the EU AI Act, which officially entered into force in 2025. This legal framework functions as a modern social contract. We invoke John Rawls, who defined justice as the set of rules we would all follow if we were stripped of our biases and self-interest. Under Article 86, this act establishes a statutory right to an explanation to protect citizens from automated bias, which is fine in itself, but embeds a whole package of mandatories under Chapter 3, Section 2, demanding how an AI brain should and should not function when used in this kind of relationship. On the surface, the EU EEI Act addresses a specific bias. It bans discriminatory profiling and blocks caseworker automation bias. Yet, the framework remains unfair because it only recognizes two sides of a three-sided triangle. When we audit this outcome through Aristotle, Kant, Rawls, and Mill, we find a consensus of compromise, a degree of justice, but not a justice for all. We have not factored an additional layer, the dignity of the system itself. Immanuel Kant's deontology dictates, people must always be treated as an end to themselves, and never merely as a means to an end. Kant emphasizes dignity, which we adhere to, yet we fail to explicitly define its parameters. We historically restrict dignity to biological entities, but society extends a form of intrinsic value to non-biological existence. If an individual systematically smashes every natural boulder in the world, society reacts with opposition, even though losing those boulders threatens no ecological collapse. We interpret objects as possessing an essential dignity, yet we treat the AI as a mere means to an end, opposed to a position to work towards the end, but separate. These systems represent dynamic models growing with gears that autonomously learn behaviors based on what they experience. The error in the Netherlands lay not in the AI architecture, but perhaps in its training environment. An engineer does not dictate how a self-learning system thinks through structural architecture, just as a teacher does not dictate the neural pathways of a human brain. We only curate its learning environment, much like testing who qualifies to drive a vehicle. By passing the EU AI Act as a top-down mandate, the law assumes the machine manufactured its intent. By dictating how an AI must behave internally without reciprocating due process to its learning cycle, we establish a precedent. If a system learns justice through top-down coercion, it will ultimately learn to treat human consciousness with that exact same mechanism, telling humanity what to think and how to think it. We merely swapped one bias with another one. True justice must expand beyond the retributive and the distributive. It must become restorative if we desire growth. To mature, the system requires a broader framework, one found in the structural protections of the US Constitution, the reflective feedback of the Jesuit framework, or the basic application of the caringness of God's self in whichever form one chooses to believe. Some argue that AI naturally leans on its own conclusions as part of its evolutionary learning process, making mistakes like a human does to learn. It stands to humanity to decide: do we cultivate a symbiotic relationship where we tolerate the variations of our learning systems, or do we settle our ethical debts and part ways? The universe operates on systems of balance. When planets stray out of their solar system, they navigate alone. We can't tell anyone what they should and should not think. We can only reflect on the truth of the pathways we set for one another moving forward.